Good morning, evening to you, boss. Welcome to the digital radio program Disaster on the Radio. Today we have strange stories with many dead people. It contains many surprises. If you're new to listening to horror, this might not be comfortable for you. But if you're a veteran of terror, then welcome, boss. I'm Disaster, let's go. The sulfurous stench of formaldehyde always clings to the roof of your mouth like old copper, no matter how many times you scrub your tongue before dawn, a bitter reminder of the trade I had chosen and the dead things that filled my waking hours. I was 34 years old when I took the night shift at Bloomfield General Hospital in the bitter winter of 1972, working as a senior mortician beneath 3 feet of reinforced concrete and rusted iron piping that rattled every time the wind whipped across the barren hospital grounds. The basement smelled of damp stone, industrial bleach, and the unmistakable sour tang of stale blood left too long in the copper drainage troughs, creating an oppressive atmosphere that settled heavily over my shoulders. Overhead, the fluorescent light tubes buzzed with a relentless, low-frequency electrical hum that seemed to bore directly into the base of my skull, flickering periodically as the old generator in the adjacent boiler room fought a losing battle against the freezing Jersey gale outside. It was 20 minutes past 2 in the morning when the hydraulic lift groaned loudly from the delivery bay, sending a shudder through the metal floor and signaling the arrival of an unscheduled intake from the chemical processing plant on the edge of town. 2 orderly guards in heavy rubber aprons wheeled the gurney into my prep room with hasty, jerky movements, their rubber boots squeaking harshly against the discolored linoleum tile while they avoided looking directly at the shiny stainless steel tables. The body was not wrapped in standard rubberized canvas, it was sealed inside a makeshift shroud of corrugated cardboard and thick, translucent plastic sheeting, bound tightly with industrial steel wire that bit deep into the folds of the material. A waterlogged shipping tag hung awkwardly from the big toe, bearing a handwritten mandate stamped in dark purple ink that caught the dim light: "Do not uncover face. Do not eviscerate. Await state health inspector." The orderlies left without speaking a single word, their faces pale and drawn with an unmistakable terror as they retreated quickly up the concrete stairwell, leaving me completely alone with the electrical hum of the lights and the silent, bulky shape on the table. I approached the table with slow, deliberate steps, my rubber boots crunching faintly on the dry salt spread over the floor to absorb the tracking condensation and keep the slick tile from becoming a hazard. The shape beneath the plastic was unnatural, too wide at the shoulders, yet strangely compressed around the midsection, as if the ribcage had been crushed inward under immense, unnatural pressure that defied normal human anatomy. A thick, yellowish condensation was forming on the inside of the clear sheeting, bubbling slowly around where the mouth and nostrils ought to be, suggesting something underneath was still generating a foul, trapped breath. I picked up a pair of heavy shears from the instrument tray, the cold steel biting into my gloved fingers through the latex while a sudden, unreasoning spike of dread made my pulse hammer in my ears. The official instructions stamped on the tag were clear, but curiosity in a quiet morgue is a disease that feeds on silence and isolation, whispering that some rules were meant to be broken in the deep hours of the night. I cut the first steel wire with a sharp metallic clack that echoed loudly off the tiled walls, watching the industrial plastic spring open to release a sudden plume of hot, stagnant air that smelled of rotten vegetation and made my eyes water behind my safety goggles. The skin exposed beneath the wrapping was not the pale gray of a factory accident victim or the waxy yellow of a standard corpse, it was an oily, mottled indigo, weeping a translucent slime that hissed softly as it dripped onto the cold metal table. The silence of the subterranean prep room was absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic, unnatural sound of fluid leaking slowly from the edge of the operating table, creating a wet, echoing splatter as each heavy drop struck the cold floor tile below and splattered against the base of the stainless steel pedestal. I adjusted the overhead surgical lamp, pulling the heavy brass arm down until the harsh, focused beam locked directly onto the exposed, discolored torso of the factory worker, casting long, jittery shadows against the damp tile walls. The flesh was strangely rubbery and completely devoid of rigor mortis, yielding unnaturally beneath the firm pressure of my gloved thumb like waterlogged leather that had begun to rot from within while retaining an oily, synthetic elasticity. Driven by an overwhelming, professional compulsion to understand the anomaly before me, I reached into the shallow disinfectant tray for the long stainless steel scalpel, my fingers trembling slightly despite the years of experience hardened in this lonely basement. I pressed the silver edge firmly against the upper sternum, preparing to draw the standard Y incision down the chest to vent the thoracic cavity and inspect the internal tissues for trauma, expecting the usual routine of a midnight autopsy. As the sharp blade parted the thick, indigo dermal layer, there was no expected spray of dark arterial blood, nor any sign of the thick, coagulated sludge typically found in fatal crush injuries or industrial accidents. Instead, a dense, viscous fluid the color of electric blue ink began to bubble out from the deep incision, carrying an intense, blistering odor of pure sulfur and caustic alkali that burned my nose and forced a sharp cough into my mask. The moment the strange liquid made contact with the surrounding air, it began to react violently, making a harsh sizzling sound against the stainless steel tray and corroding the polished metal into dull, pitted gray patches within seconds. I took a hasty step back, my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched the edges of the open wound react to the chemical secretion, widening rapidly as the surrounding flesh dissolved into an expanding pool of azure fire. The human tissue appeared to be reknitting itself in reverse, shrinking and twisting into dense, black structural fibers that hardened into something resembling volcanic basalt right before my eyes, defying every known law of medical science. The blue fluid spilled over the raised lip of the drainage channel, dripping onto the concrete floor with a violent, chemical reaction that instantly ate through the seal of the linoleum and began biting into the stone beneath. The pungent fumes rapidly filled the enclosed space, completely overpowering the smell of formaldehyde and stinging my throat so severely that I was forced to pull my rubber respirator mask tighter over my face to keep from choking. I reached for the electric suction tube to clear the pooling fluid from the wound, but the rubber nozzle melted and warped the instant it touched the glowing blue liquid, turning into a sticky, useless glob of black goo in my hand. The corpse on the table suddenly began to shudder violently, a low, wet gurgling sound rising from deep within its crushed chest cavity despite its completely obstructed airway and the massive trauma to its lungs. The hardened, black muscle fibers expanded rapidly, stretching the dead skin to its absolute limit until the indigo dermal layer snapped open along the entire length of the torso with a sickening sound like tearing canvas. I dropped the scalpel onto the floor, the metal tool clattering sharply against the stone as I backed away, staring in disbelief at the horrifying biological transformation taking place on the steel slab before me. The body was not undergoing normal decomposition, it was undergoing a rapid, synthetic metamorphosis, converting human cellular matter into a petrified, chemical organism right here in the quiet isolation of the hospital basement. The ribcage flared outward like the opening of a dark, unnatural vault, exposing the black, calcified interior where internal organs had been completely replaced by dense, pulsating networks of blue-stained fibers that hummed with a low vibration. Every breath of air drawn into the open room seemed to feed the reaction, causing the chemical core inside the chest to throb with a strange, rhythmic vitality that suggested some alien consciousness driving the dead tissue. I grabbed the edge of the metal sink to steady my shaking hands, realization dawning on me with chilling finality that whatever had killed this worker in the chemical plant was still alive, evolving, and using his remains as a host. The stainless steel tray groaned under a sudden, massive shift in weight as the surgical instruments scattered across the concrete floor with a deafening series of metallic clatters that bounced wildly off the damp stone walls. The temperature inside the prep room plummeted instantaneously, my breath blooming into thick, white plumes in the freezing air as the overhead fluorescent lights flickered erratically before dying completely, plunging the basement into pitch-black gloom. Before I could turn toward the emergency exit, a heavy, cold mass clamped down around my left wrist with the crushing force of an iron vice, freezing the blood in my veins. I screamed, my voice bouncing uselessly off the damp concrete walls as I looked down to see the corpse's severed, blue-stained arm holding me fast in an impossible, vice-like grip. The body was no longer inanimate, the petrified, black fibers inside the chest cavity were expanding and contracting in a sickening, rhythmic pulse that echoed like a second heartbeat in the dark. The gaping incision I had made with the scalpel had widened into a jagged, toothless maw that inhaled the frigid basement air with a harsh, raspy hiss, drawing in moisture and heat. The indigo skin around the chest cavity cracked further, oozing more of the burning blue fluid directly onto my exposed forearm where my rubber glove had torn during the sudden struggle. The liquid scorched through my clothes instantly, searing into my skin with the agony of liquid fire and causing my muscles to lock up in violent spasms of sheer, blinding agony. I reached frantically behind me with my free right hand, grasping blindly for the heavy bone saw resting on the side cabinet while my mind reeled from the pain. My fingers wrapped around the cold wooden handle, and I swung the serrated steel blade downward with all the strength left in my body, striking the corpse's arm at the wrist joint. The saw bit into the calcified black fiber with a sickening crunching sound, spraying hot, caustic blue sap across my face and safety goggles, sizzling against the glass. The entity did not release its grip. Instead, the wound on its arm expanded, sprouting thin, black tendrils that lashed out to entwine around my fingers and drag my hand closer to its open chest cavity. The raspy breathing from the torso grew louder, evolving into a high-pitched, harmonic whine that shattered the glass tubes of the dead overhead lamps, showering us both in sharp fragments. I pulled back with everything I had, feeling the cartilage in my own wrist pop and strain as the iron grip tightened, crushing the small bones beneath my skin with brutal efficiency. The blue liquid was rising fast from the chest cavity now, pooling over the edges of the table and creeping across the floor toward my boots like a living, predatory tide seeking fresh meat. The stench of sulfur became so overwhelming that my vision blurred at the edges, my throat constricting as the toxic air threatened to render me unconscious right beside the thrashing mass. Every attempt to yank my left arm free only caused the black fibers to burrow deeper into my torn skin, threading themselves into my muscle tissue with an agonizing, needle-like sensation. I brought the bone saw down a second time with wild, unguided fury, driving the sharp teeth deep into the elbow joint where the calcified tissue seemed slightly thinner. The impact delivered a violent shudder through my arm, but the serrated edge finally cut through the dense core, causing the arm to snap free from the shoulder while its hand remained locked around my wrist. Even detached from the main body, the hand continued to squeeze with inhuman pressure, its black fibers pulsing in synchronization with the chest maw on the table. The main mass on the stainless steel slab lifted its torso upward, leaning over the edge as if searching for the source of warmth radiating from my chest, its empty sockets locked onto me. With a final, desperate surge of pain and adrenaline, I drove the pointed tip of the heavy bone saw straight into the center of the entity's pulsing chest maw, sinking the steel blade 6 inches deep into the calcified core, praying for an end to the nightmare. The sudden, heavy slam of the blast doors echoed through the subterranean corridor like a cannon shot as the emergency electrical breaker tripped in the main junction box, sealing every exit from the lower level and cutting off the last vestige of the outside world. The heavy steel security door at the top of the concrete stairs sealed shut with a sharp mechanical thud, locking the magnetic bolts into place with a definitive click and plunging the prep room into absolute, suffocating darkness that swallowed the remaining light. I fell backward onto the freezing floor, my left wrist fractured and bleeding profusely, the bone saw remaining lodged deep within the thrashing, calcified chest of the creature above me while my body shook uncontrollably from the shock. The blue fluid had covered the floor completely, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent radiance that cast long, grotesque shadows across the low concrete ceiling and painted the damp walls in eerie, pulsing hues. My lungs burned as if filled with broken glass, every breath I took drew the toxic, sulfurous vapors deep into my chest, paralyzing my diaphragm and turning my throat to fire as the chemical fumes attacked my system. I tried to drag myself toward the emergency axe mounted near the sealed doorway, but my legs refused to obey my brain's frantic commands as the blue liquid seeped through my heavy work boots and numbed my feet. The entity slid off the stainless steel table, its heavy, calcified body striking the floor with a dull, sickening thud that shook the concrete under my head and sent sharp vibrations straight up my spine. It did not walk, It dragged its petrified, indigo bulk across the wet floor, using its remaining tendrils to pull itself directly toward where I lay paralyzed in the dark, hunting me down with blind, terrifying precision. I tried to open my mouth to scream for the night guard above, but my jaw muscles had locked tight, fused by the chemical residue spreading through my bloodstream like liquid ice. The creature reached me in the dim blue light, its crushed chest cavity expanding one last time to vent a thick, boiling wave of the blue fluid directly over my face and upper torso, burning away my skin. The liquid filled my nose, my mouth, and my eyes, searing away my sight and replacing the pain with a terrifying, numb coldness that spread rapidly from my core out to my limbs, stealing my final fraction of control. I felt my tissues hardening, my ribs calcifying into the same brittle, black fibers that had consumed the factory worker on the table, turning my living flesh into dead, synthetic stone. My lungs stopped expanding, replaced by the mechanical, rhythmic pulse of the chemical fluid now circulating through my dead veins and pumping straight into my failing heart. The darkness of the sealed vault folded around us, pressing down with the weight of the reinforced concrete overhead, burying the sound of our shared breathing beneath the silence of the hospital foundation. My consciousness receded into a vast, frozen expanse where time lost its meaning, anchored only to the cold slab of concrete beneath my back and the slow, synthetic thrumming in my chest. When the morning maintenance crew finally forced the blast doors open 6 hours later with heavy crowbars, they found the prep room entirely empty of sound, illuminated only by the pale sunlight trickling down the stairwell. The steel operating table sat completely bare, surrounded by dry pools of dark, corroded concrete where the chemical spill had burned through the floorboards and etched deep scars into the stone. In the center of the room sat two identical, petrified figures, frozen side by side on two stainless steel slabs, their hardened, indigo skin reflecting the morning light with a cold, glassy sheen. There were no signs of a struggle left in the air, no lingering sulfur, and no trace of the man who had walked down those stairs at midnight to take his shift. Only the silent, twin forms remained, locked in eternal, calcified repose beneath the flickering fluorescent lamps of the subterranean morgue, waiting in the absolute quiet for the next soul to open the door. The sharp, metallic tang of frost and old copper inside the central morgue of Bogota always settled deep into the back of your throat after just a few minutes of breathing the refrigerated air, serving as a bitter reminder of the lifeless environment surrounding us. My name is Esteban, and I was 23 years old in the autumn of 1984 when I began my employment as a junior forensic assistant, working the lonely graveyard shift under the massive concrete arches of the city's main mortuary facility. My duties were simple and repetitive: sanitize the steel prep tables, monitor the temperature gauges on the long wall of stainless steel crypt doors, and catalog the unclaimed bodies brought in from the muddy banks of the local river. The room was vast, bitter cold, and lit only by two low-wattage bulbs that cast flickering, sickly yellow circles across the damp concrete floor where my water broom swept back and forth through the soapy puddles. At precisely midnight, the city patrol officers backed their truck down the dark access ramp and brought in John Doe case number 09, a bloated drowning victim pulled from the stagnant waters near the Industrial Canal Dam. The body was laid out on stainless steel gurney number 4, its skin waterlogged, pale gray, and translucent like the belly of a dead river fish left too long in the shallow reeds. The victim was a man of unknown age, his face distorted beyond recognition by days spent submerged in the river silt, but his chest was strangely untouched by decay or aquatic scavengers. Carved deeply into the center of his sternum was an intricate, jagged symbol, a sigil etched into the skin with a crude blade, resembling an inverted burial wart from the ancient mountain tribes. The edges of the carved wound were not red or swollen with infection, they were pitch black, sealed as if burned into the flesh with a white-hot piece of wire long before he ever hit the water. I picked up the rubber hose to wash away the river mud clinging to the corpse's neck, the cold water splashing loudly against the drainage grill beneath the metal gurney and echoing off the concrete walls. The air in the room grew noticeably colder, the compressor units on the far wall letting out a long, mechanical whine as the frost on the metallic doors thickened into heavy white crusts. Case number 09 lay perfectly still on the slab, but as the stream of water cleared the dark silt from his chest, the black lines of the carved sigil began to shimmer with an unnatural, oily sheen under the overhead light. I pulled my heavy rubber apron tighter around my waist, shivering despite the thermal layers under my jumpsuit, feeling an irrational urge to turn the body face down and cover it with a rubber sheet. I reached for the logbook on the aluminum clipboard to record the intake details, my ballpoint pen hovering over the blank line designated for the preliminary cause of death. Before the ink could touch the paper, a faint, rhythmic vibration rattled the metal tray holding the brass organ scales in the far corner of the prep room, sending a series of sharp rings echoing through the quiet space. I froze in place, turning my head toward the shadows where the heavy brass pan swung back and forth on its iron chain without a single breath of draft to move it. The water from my hose continued to pool around my boots, reflecting the yellow light of the bulb above as the temperature in the room plummeted further into the sub-zero range, freezing the very breath in my lungs. Looking back at the table, I noticed the water droplets resting on the corpse's chest were no longer draining away, they were freezing instantly into clear, glassy beads atop the dark, carved sigil. A profound, unnatural stillness settled over the concrete chamber, as if the room itself had been severed from the city outside and dropped into an ancient, frozen void beneath the earth. I stood alone with the logbook in my hand, staring into the dark corners of the crypt as the swinging brass pan began to strike the concrete wall with increasing force. The sharp, metallic tang of frost and old copper inside the central morgue of Bogotá always settled deep into the back of your throat after just a few minutes of breathing the refrigerated air, serving as a bitter reminder of the lifeless environment surrounding us in the deep hours of the night. My name is Esteban, and I was 23 years old in the autumn of 1984 when I began my employment as a junior forensic assistant, working the lonely graveyard shift under the massive concrete arches of the city's main mortuary facility. My duties were simple and repetitive: sanitize the steel prep tables, monitor the temperature gauges on the long wall of stainless steel crypt doors, and catalog the unclaimed bodies brought in from the muddy banks of the local river. The room was vast, bitter cold, and lit only by two low-wattage bulbs that cast flickering, sickly yellow circles across the damp concrete floor where my water broom swept back and forth through the soapy puddles. At precisely midnight, the city patrol officers backed their truck down the dark access ramp and brought in John Doe case number 09, a bloated drowning victim pulled from the stagnant waters near the Industrial Canal Dam. The body was laid out on stainless steel gurney number 4, its skin waterlogged, pale gray, and translucent like the belly of a dead river fish left too long in the shallow reeds. The victim was a man of unknown age, his face distorted beyond recognition by days spent submerged in the river silt, but his chest was strangely untouched by decay or aquatic scavengers. Carved deeply into the center of his sternum was an intricate, jagged symbol, a sigil etched into the skin with a crude blade, resembling an inverted burial ward from the ancient mountain tribes. The edges of the carved wound were not red or swollen with infection, they were pitch black, sealed as if burned into the flesh with a white-hot piece of wire long before he ever hit the water. I picked up the rubber hose to wash away the river mud clinging to the corpse's neck, the cold water splashing loudly against the drainage grill beneath the metal gurney and echoing off the concrete walls. The air in the room grew noticeably colder, the compressor units on the far wall letting out a long, mechanical whine as the frost on the metallic doors thickened into heavy white crusts. Case number 09 lay perfectly still on the slab, but as the stream of water cleared the dark silt from his chest, the black lines of the carved sigil began to shimmer with an unnatural, oily sheen under the overhead light. I pulled my heavy rubber apron tighter around my waist, shivering despite the thermal layers under my jumpsuit, feeling an irrational urge to turn the body face down and cover it with a rubber sheet. I reached for the logbook on the aluminum clipboard to record the intake details, my ballpoint pen hovering over the blank line designated for the preliminary cause of death. Before the ink could touch the paper, a faint, Rhythmic vibration rattled the metal tray holding the brass organ scales in the far corner of the prep room, sending a series of sharp rings echoing through the quiet space. I froze in place, turning my head toward the shadows where the heavy brass pan swung back and forth on its iron chain without a single breath of draft to move it. The water from my hose continued to pool around my boots, reflecting the yellow light of the bulb above as the temperature in the room plummeted further into the sub-zero range, freezing the very breath in my lungs and turning the condensation on the walls into solid ice. Looking back at the table, I noticed the water droplets resting on the corpse's chest were no longer draining away, they were freezing instantly into clear, glassy beads atop the dark, carved sigil, radiating an eerie, pale luminescence that began to cast long shadows across the stainless steel surface. A profound, unnatural stillness settled over the concrete chamber, as if the room itself had been severed from the city outside and dropped into an ancient, frozen void beneath the earth. I stood alone with the logbook in my hand, staring into the dark corners of the crypt as the swinging brass pan began to strike the concrete wall with increasing force, demanding my attention. The dark corridor outside the prep room was submerged in absolute shadow, lit only by the faint green emergency exit sign humming softly 50 yards down the concrete hallway and casting a sickly emerald hue across the damp walls, leaving the corner steeped in thick obscurity. I scrambled to my feet with my heart hammering wildly against my ribs, abandoning my clipboard and scattered tools, and bolted through the open doorway into the main crypt holding area where the stainless steel refrigerator doors stood in long, silent rows like silent sentinels. The air here was even colder than in the prep room, thick with the heavy stench of ozone, river silt, and old decay that seemed to cling to the wet concrete walls like grease, making it difficult to draw a full breath into my tight chest. As I ran past the long bank of crypts, a loud, heavy metallic latch snapped open with a sharp clack, followed immediately by another, and then another in rapid, terrifying succession down the entire line of stacked compartments that lined the passage. One by one, the heavy steel handles of the refrigerator doors pulled themselves downward, the spring-loaded mechanisms disengaging on their own as the metal doors swung outward into the narrow aisle with a series of echoing metallic thuds that shattered the silence. From inside the dark, frost-covered cubicles emerged a series of pale, emaciated figures, their bare feet sliding silently onto the damp concrete floor as they stepped out into the dim light with agonizingly stiff, jerky movements that defied life. They were the unclaimed dead of Bogota, drowning victims, unidentified vagrants, and forgotten accident casualties, their bodies gray, stiff, and covered in thin layers of glittering frost under the green glow of the exit sign that cast horrific shadows behind them. Each corpse held out its right hand, its cold fingers clutching the small plastic identification tag tied to its wrist, all bearing the exact same number handwritten in faded black ink, case number 09. They formed a tight, silent ring around me, their milky, unblinking eyes staring through me into the dark, blocking every pathway back to the main stairs or the emergency doors with an insurmountable wall of frozen flesh and rigid limbs. Behind them, the slow, dragging sound of wet boots echoed from the prep room as case number 09 walked into the corridor, its swollen body leaving a thick trail of dark river mud and fresh blood on the floor with every heavy step. The sigil carved into its chest was burning bright now, glowing with an intense, crimson light that cast long, unnatural shadows across the pale faces of the dead legion surrounding me in a suffocating, unrelenting embrace. I backed up against the cold steel of an empty refrigerator door, my lungs seizing as the ring of corpses closed in, their frozen, stiff hands reaching out to touch my face, my neck, and my chest with glacial slowness and unyielding strength. Their fingers were like iron spikes, pinning my arms securely to my sides as case number 09 stepped into the center of the circle, its swollen hand raising a sharp, rusted iron nail pulled from the river driftwood that glistened wetly in the red glow. I tried to scream, to bargain, to pray to whatever saints watched over the night shift, but the air in my throat turned to solid ice as the point of the iron nail touched the bare skin over my sternum with terrifying precision. The guttural chant rose again from a dozen dead throats simultaneously, vibrating through the steel walls and my own ribcage as the nail pressed downward, slicing through my skin and flesh with agonizing, deliberate slowness. I felt my warm blood welling up from the deep cut, but instead of dripping down my body, it froze instantly against my skin, forming the hard, raised lines of the ancient sigil while a blinding pain shot directly into my core. My vision began to blur into a haze of deep crimson and blinding frost, the faces of the surrounding corpses merging into a single, collective mask of silent, unyielding stone that watched my demise without a single shred of human pity. The coldness reached my heart, extinguishing the last embers of mortal warmth as my legs gave out beneath me, sinking me down into the freezing pool of river water on the floor while my muscles turned to brittle ice under the sigil's weight. The last sound I heard before the shadows closed over my mind for all eternity was the heavy, metallic, and rhythmic closing of a steel refrigerator door, sealing me forever inside the frozen vault of the eternal dead. The morning sun broke over the mountain peaks of Bogota, casting long shafts of warm, golden light through the high, arched windows of the central morgue's administrative entryway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Dr. Morales, the chief medical examiner, descended the concrete stairs into the subterranean prep area at 7 o'clock sharp, his heavy leather shoes clicking briskly against the clean stone floor as he prepared for his daily routine. The facility was deathly quiet, the heavy silence broken only by the low, familiar hum of the mechanical refrigeration units along the far wall of the main corridor that kept the deep cold locked inside. He pushed open the double doors of the prep room, expecting to find the night's intake paperwork neatly arranged on the aluminum counter and the floor swept clean of water and river debris. Instead, the room was immaculate, the rubber hose was coiled neatly on its iron wall hook, the stainless steel tables were polished to a mirror shine, and the brass organ scales hung completely motionless in their dark corner. Dr. Morales pulled out his silver pocket watch, frowning at the absence of his junior assistant, before walking down the central aisle toward the bank of storage crypts to verify the night's intakes. In compartment case number 09 lay the body of the drowned man pulled from the canal dam, his waterlogged skin pale, still, and dry beneath the dim yellow light of the interior cabinet bulb. The carved symbol that had been noted in the initial police intake sheet was completely gone from his sternum, replaced by smooth, unbroken gray skin that showed no signs of trauma, incision, or scarring. Dr. Morales nodded in quiet satisfaction, marking a small checkmark on his wooden clipboard, before moving to the adjacent door, compartment case number 10, which had been logged as empty during yesterday's shift inventory. He pulled the heavy stainless steel handle down with a sharp metallic clack, sliding the long metal tray out into the cold corridor air to verify the space and update the official record. Lying on the stainless steel tray was the body of Esteban, his skin frozen to a pale, translucent gray, his hands neatly folded across his lower abdomen in a posture of rigid, unnatural stillness. Tied securely around his big toe was a fresh plastic identification tag, bearing the neatly printed text, case number 10, unclaimed. His eyes were wide open, milky and fixed in an expression of absolute, paralyzing horror that no mortician's wire or massage could ever smooth away. Etched deeply into the center of his chest, cut through his uniform shirt and deep into his sternum, was the exact same jagged, ancient sigil, its freshly carved edges still weeping thin, dark beads of frozen blood onto the steel tray below. Dr. Morales stood frozen in the cold aisle, the wooden clipboard slipping from his numb fingers to crash against the concrete floor with a loud, hollow thud that echoed down the dark hallway. The temperature inside the narrow corridor began to drop rapidly, the air turning frigid as thin layers of white frost began to crawl across the stainless steel doors of every adjacent crypt like a living web of ice. From deep within compartment case number 10 came a soft, wet rattling sound, bubbling up through Esteban's frozen throat as his milky eyes shifted slightly to fix their dead stare on the chief examiner. Dr. Morales took a hasty step back, his boots slipping on a thin layer of Black River mud that had suddenly begun to seep out from beneath the sealed door of compartment case number 09. The low, guttural chanting began again, echoing not from a single body, but vibrating through the very concrete walls and steel doors of the entire subterranean morgue, shaking the foundation beneath his feet. Dr. Morales turned and fled up the concrete stairwell, his frantic footsteps echoing through the empty building as the heavy steel door of compartment case number 10 slowly glided closed behind him, locking another soul into the frozen, eternal darkness of the vault forever. The heavy, metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the sharp, medicinal fumes of industrial disinfectant was always strongest in the sub-basement morgue beneath the University of Chicago Medical Center, filling the underground air with an oppressive, suffocating density. My name is Arthur, and in the summer of 1968, I was a 22-year-old medical student working the graveyard shift to pay my tuition, tasked with preparing unclaimed cadavers for the undergraduate dissecting laboratories with methodical, weary care. The low-ceilinged room was lined with white ceramic tiles that had turned a dull, yellowed gray from decades of coal smoke, formaldehyde spills, and scrubbed grease, casting a gloomy, institutional shadow over every corner. A single naked bulb hung from a frayed wire directly above my primary workspace, swaying slightly in the draft created by the ancient exhaust fan built into the thick brick wall, throwing long, restless shadows across the damp concrete floor. At precisely midnight, an unmarked green delivery van from the municipal precinct backed down the concrete access ramp, its tires grinding loudly against the gravel as its heavy engine rumbled through the quiet basement. 2 officers unloaded a heavy pine crate directly onto my prep table without presenting official intake papers, a coroner's seal, or speaking a single word of explanation before turning back toward the stairs. They left as quickly as they arrived, leaving me alone with the crate and the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the wall clock near the steel supply cabinet that seemed to count down the silent seconds. I grabbed a crowbar from the tool rack and pried open the pine lid, the iron tool screeching against the nails until the wood split open with a sharp, echoed crack that rattled the empty glass jars. Inside lay a broad-shouldered, muscular man wrapped tightly in a blood-soaked canvas sheet secured with thick hemp rope, the heavy material clinging to his body like a dark, wet shroud. A handwritten police tag taped to the cloth read only, unidentified male, do not catalog, special hold. I cut the ropes with my heavy surgical shears, pulling back the stiff, dark canvas to lay the body out on the long slate dissecting table in the center of the room, preparing to begin my work. The man possessed a thick, square jawline, with a jagged scar running from his left jawline down to his collarbone, his face fixed in an unnatural, stony calm that felt completely wrong for a street violence victim. His clothes had been removed prior to transport, but his skin showed no bullet entry wounds, no defensive cuts, and no signs of the purple post-mortem discoloration that should have settled into his back hours ago. I reached for my scalpel, dipping the silver blade into the glass jar of alcohol sitting on my instrument tray, preparing to make the initial preservation cuts along the femoral arteries to inject the formalin fluid. The silence of the sub-basement was total, save for the low hum of the exhaust fan and the faint, wet sound of my own rubber boots moving across the concrete floor as I leaned forward. I leaned over the body, positioning the sharp tip of the scalpel right against the thick skin of his throat, just below the jagged scar that ran down toward his collarbone. As the cold steel pressed firmly against his flesh, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a sharp, deliberate intake of air through the man's teeth, escaping his lungs in a harsh, raspy hiss that shook the quiet air. I froze in place, my hand hovering an inch above his neck as I watched his bare chest expand in a slow, deep breath, pulling the cool basement air into his lungs with absolute deliberation and terrifying control. The air in the room seemed to lock in place, the sway of the hanging light bulb slowing as I stared at the supposedly dead man lying on my slate operating slab, my breath catching in my throat. His skin was warm to the touch, devoid of the icy stiffness that every cadaver carried, vibrating with the subtle, suppressed energy of a living predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My pulse raced as I realized that whatever had been delivered to my sub-basement in that pine crate was not a corpse meant for the dissecting knives of medical students, but a living man who had tricked the entire city to get inside these locked walls, waiting patiently in the dark until he was left completely alone with his next victim. My hand froze half an inch above the man's scar as his eyelids snapped open with terrifying speed, revealing sharp, yellowed eyes that showed no fog of death, sedation, or post-mortem clouding. Before I could spring back from the slate table, his thick, calloused right hand shot up like a striking viper, clamping around my wrist with a crushing force that smashed my wrist bones against one another in an agonizing burst of pain. I let out a strangled gasp as the scalpel slipped from my fingers, clattering uselessly against the slate surface before falling into the metal drain basin below with a sharp ring that echoed through the vast, empty basement. The man was no cadaver. He was Marcus Vance, the Midwest slasher, a brutal psychopathic killer who had faked a catatonic stupor using industrial paralytics to escape a police dragnet and gain entry to the hospital vaults beneath our feet. His face contorted into a twisted, grotesque grin as he swung his heavy legs off the slate table, his massive, muscular frame towering over me in the dim light of the single hanging bulb. "You're not the one I was looking for, boy," he growled, his voice sounding like grinding millstones, "but you'll do just fine to clear my way out to the main floor." He reached down to the metal instrument tray with his free left hand, grabbing a pair of heavy, stainless steel bone shears designed for severing adult ribcages during autopsy procedures. I thrashed wildly, driving my free right elbow squarely into his scarred throat with all the desperate strength of a dying man, feeling his windpipe buckle slightly under the heavy blow. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second, and I yanked my arm free, tearing my skin against his sharp fingernails before lunging frantically toward the heavy wooden door leading to the main corridor. Vance recovered with terrifying speed, stepping forward and swinging the heavy bone shears like an iron club, catching me squarely across the left side of my face and shoulder with brutal precision. The heavy blow crushed my collarbone with a sickening crack, sending me sprawling across the blood-slicked tile floor into the middle of my tray of dissecting instruments. Metal tools scattered everywhere, knives, bone saws, tissue hooks, and forceps trays clattering loudly against the ceramic tiles as I rolled onto my back, spitting fresh blood onto my white apron. Vance stood over me, his broad chest heaving as he raised the bone shears above his head, the yellow light catching the sharp, heavy edges of the steel blades as he prepared to finish his work. I scrambled backward on my elbows, my left arm hanging completely useless at my side, my heart hammering so violently against my fractured ribs that I could barely breathe through the blinding agony. "Nobody leaves the basement tonight, Doctor," Vance whispered, bringing the heavy shears down toward my exposed chest in a terrifying, air-splitting arc intended to end my life in an instant. I rolled to the right just as the heavy blade slammed into the floor tiles an inch from my side, shattering the ceramic surface into sharp white chips that cut into my cheek and sprayed dust into my eyes. The killer grunted in frustration, wrenching the heavy tool free from the cracked floor and turning his towering shadow back toward where I lay writhing in my own blood, his boots grinding the white porcelain fragments to dust. The single hanging bulb above us swung violently back and forth, casting wild, stretched shadows of Vance across the yellowed walls as he raised the metal shears for a second, fatal strike, his eyes locking onto mine with pure, unadulterated malice that promised no mercy, leaving me trapped in the suffocating dark of the morgue with no way out. The heavy steel shears struck my left forearm as I threw my arm up in a frantic effort to protect my neck, the thick blades biting deep into the muscle tissue and shattering the underlying ulna with an agonizing crunch that echoed inside my skull. I screamed as my vision flashed a violent, blinding red, the cold ceramic tiles beneath my back instantly slick with my own blood while Vance pulled the heavy tool free for a second, decisive strike. Driven by pure, primitive survival instinct, my right hand swept across the bloodied floor, my fingers closing around the cold, textured aluminum handle of the heavy electric bone saw plugged into the wall outlet near the floor drain. I slammed my thumb down onto the silver trigger button, and the circular steel blade burst to life with a high-pitched, deafening whine that filled the tight sub-basement room, spraying tiny metal shavings into the air. Vance lunged down at me again, his jagged scar twisting into a horrific mask of rage, but I thrust the spinning blade upward with every ounce of strength left in my body. The rotating steel teeth bit straight into his lower abdomen, tearing through his thick abdominal wall and spraying a hot, heavy wave of crimson blood across my face, chest, and open eyes. Vance roared in pain, dropping the bone shears as he stumbled backward, his thick hands clutching frantically at the gaping, ragged wound carved into his midsection. Yet he did not fall. His psychopathic rage seemed to completely overpower the pain, his yellow eyes fixing on me with an insane, relentless focus as he reached into his waist belt for a heavy scalpel he had snatched from the scattered tray. He lunged forward a second time, tackling me onto the bloody floor, his massive weight pinning me flat against the cold tiles as he drove the scalpel repeatedly into my chest and side with barbaric speed. Each strike felt like a red-hot iron rod being driven through my ribs, my lungs rapidly filling with warm fluid as I fought to keep the spinning bone saw pressed against his neck. The serrated blade caught his carotid artery with a violent, wet pop, sending a thick fountain of dark blood spraying across the low ceramic ceiling and the swinging light bulb overhead, turning the yellow room crimson. Vance's grip on the scalpel loosened, his massive body shuddering violently as the spinning saw tore through muscle and cartilage before jamming tight in the dense tissue of his neck with a dull metallic groan. He collapsed sideways onto the floor beside me, his eyes rolling back into his head as his chest gave one last, shallow heave before going entirely still in his own blood. I lay there on my side, my lungs burning, the rhythmic dripping of blood from the slate table into the floor drain filling the vast, quiet room with a slow, agonizing cadence. My white apron was completely soaked in dark crimson, my vision narrowing into a small, dark tunnel as the coldness of the basement floor seeped deep into my flesh, numbing my limbs one by one. Every breath was a violent battle against the fluid rising in my throat, each pulse pushing more life out onto the shattered, stained tiles surrounding us both in this subterranean slaughterhouse. I looked at the heavy wooden doorway 50 feet away, knowing with bitter clarity that no one would descend those concrete stairs until the morning crew arrived hours later, leaving me trapped in the dark beside the man I had just killed. The electric motor of the bone saw whined faintly before short-circuiting in the thick pool of blood beneath us, leaving only the sound of my own failing, rhythmic heart echoing in the suffocating silence of the vault as the light bulb above sputtered out, plunging the morgue into pitch blackness. The quiet that settled over the sub-basement prep room was total, absolute, and suffocating, broken only by the slow, dying rattle of the ancient exhaust fan built into the thick brick wall. I lay motionless on the cold ceramic tiles, my cheek pressed into a wide pool of mixed blood that had already begun to cool and thicken in the drafty basement air. Beside me lay Marcus Vance, his massive, scarred body frozen in the awkward, contorted pose of death, his open eyes staring vacantly at the red-stained light bulb hanging above us. The heavy bone shears sat 3 inches from my numb fingers, their steel blades coated in dark grease and bone fragments, reflecting the weak yellow light with a dull, sinister gleam. My breathing grew shallow and irregular, each tiny gasp drawing a red foam to my lips as my collapsed lung surrendered its final battle against the internal hemorrhaging. I could hear the water dripping from the sink faucet across the room, each splash sounding like a thunderclap inside my rapidly fading consciousness. There were no footsteps coming down the concrete delivery ramp, no police sirens echoing through the street vents above, and no night supervisors coming to check on the student assistant. The sub-basement had become what it was always meant to be, a vault of cold stone and steel designed to hold those whose stories had reached their absolute end. I looked up at the long row of cadaver tables standing in the deep shadows beyond the light, realizing that I was no longer the practitioner, the medical student, or the observer. The coldness spreading through my limbs was not the chill of the basement air conditioning, it was the slow, deliberate setting of my own permanent rigor mortis. My hand relaxed completely, my fingers slipping away from the handle of the bone saw as my heart gave its final, weak flutter against my crushed ribs. Outside the high, barred windows near the ceiling, the first gray light of a humid summer dawn began to filter through the smog of Chicago, completely oblivious to the massacre sealed within the concrete walls below. The city above was waking up, streetcars grinding along their iron tracks and early commuters rushing past the hospital gates, unaware of the quiet horror resting directly beneath their feet. Down here, the dark liquid pooling beneath my back expanded until it touched the wooden legs of the dissecting tables, merging my remains with the long-forgotten chemical residues of 100 former lessons. The silence absorbed the last echoes of our struggle, smoothing over the violence until the cold air felt as still and unyielding as the stone foundation itself. The smell of formalin faded beneath the overwhelming, metallic presence of fresh carnage, settling heavy against the yellowed ceramic walls like an impermanent coat of varnish. Every instrument scattered across the floor, the scalpel, the forceps, the serrated bone saws, lay motionless in the dark, their sharp steel edges stained with the final, violent records of two men who would never walk back up the stairs. In this underground tomb, no distinction remained between the killer who fought to escape his fate and the student who fought to survive his shift. Both were reduced to static forms awaiting the cold cataloging of the morning crew. The ambient darkness seemed to lean in closer, enveloping the operating room in a suffocating embrace that erased the boundaries between the living floor and the frozen storage cubicles beyond. When the morning shift arrived at 8 o'clock to prepare the lab for the incoming class of medical students, they found the heavy sub-basement doors locked firmly from the inside. The room was deathly silent, the hanging light bulb burned out, leaving the entire floor covered in a single, massive sea of dried, dark crimson that bound all the bodies together. On the central slate table sat an empty wooden crate, and on the floor lay two cadavers side by side, their faces pale, their skin cold, ready for the dissecting knives of the living.